Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. To now actually some of these distinctions. So some of these things like terror and insurrection and riot, there's been a lot of discussion and people trying to name what happened on January 6th. So I want to go into a media literacy to I work in this field. I work in violence and instability, and I wanted to define some of these terms so that we could kind of get beyond this meaning. So this is going to be a little bit of a interesting. Here's the terms of conflict that are in play right now, right? And they go, I've ordered them somewhat, believe it or not, from bottom to top, or top to bottom. The easiest ones to charge, and of course protest I'm starting with. That protest is a non-criminal, non-violent civil activity. So that's the baseline. This is not illegal. Then as you go down the list, it gets harder and harder to charge someone with that crime and prove they were doing that crime. It also gets harder for them to actually do that crime. The constituent elements of that act are actually getting increasingly challenging. Now, the basis for these is I work with the US government. So my definition of these terms, where it applies, is going to come from US federal law, because I'm like, why reinvent the wheel? If there's existing law, these laws were put together with a lot of thought. Let's not try and take an event like January 6th and make up new law around it. Let's apply the existing law and see where it falls. The other thing to keep in mind, and I've described this before when I discussed protests and riots, these are complex, multifaceted things where lots of stuff is going on. A difference of 5 minutes in the same place or 50 yards at the same time can create completely different perspectives of what's going on. And it is entirely possible in something as large as the Capitol or these protests and riots that happen over the summer, where you have multiple simultaneous activities going on of which all people are not sharing in that act. And this is a key point, is that you can have a riot, an insurrection, and domestic terrorism happening all at the same time, but that doesn't mean every person in the Capitol is guilty of all three of those things. You have to really be careful about what the evidence, and this is a big part of due process. Same thing that comes up when we talk about arsons in the riots over the summer. You know, just because an arson happens doesn't mean that the people in that protest are culpable of that arson, but it does mean the people who precipitated the arson are culpable. That's criminal and it's wrong. I have a very strict first principle on violence. Unless it is imminent self-defense, individual or collective self-defense from harm to person or property, violence is a no-go. So arson's out for me. Street violence is out for me. These violent acts for me across the board are first principle, they're wrong. But you can go down this list and you can begin to deconflict these terms. So let's walk through some of them. First of all, what happened at the rally? So we start with the rally. That's where the president gave his little talk. That's a protest, right? Nothing illegal there. Maybe misguided, not well informed, full of conspiracy nonsense. Probably not itself inherently illegal, except for what happens following it. And this is a key thing to know in US law. Free speech, we often don't charge incitement charges unless something actually happens. Because, and I mentioned this before, there's something called the Brandenburg test. To violate the, to make your speech criminally, to make your speech not protected by the First Amendment, to engage in criminal speech on an incitement charge, you have to prove that there was specific action directed, that action followed through immediately thereafter, and there was a high likelihood of that action occurring. If I say I want to, you know, go out and scratch a bunch of cars, or encourage everyone to go out and scratch cars, right? There's not a likelihood you guys are going to do it. When you do it, it's not going to be things. But what goes on with the rally, the reason the rally is going to come into sharp focus is the president specifically said, go down to that place. He gave encouragement. Again, I'm going to get this in the mega mullet, but there was a rally, and immediately following what he asked them to do, at least up into through the protest at the Capitol, he actually asked them to do. They followed on it. And the question is, was that a likely consequence of what he said? Because he used lots of words of fighting and things like that. That we'll get into more. But as we go through this now, everything that follows from the protest is an illegal criminal act. So first of all, riot, right? U.S. Code 20, Chapter 18, 2102. The definitions of a riot: it's an act of violence by one person that constitutes clear and present danger to property or person or property, but you have to do it while in a group of 3 or more. This is why I say riots are pretty easy. I mean, you think about this, you could have a riot at a football game, and frequently they do. You know, this is a very small threshold. You need at least 3 people, and one of them amongst them is doing something that causes harm or a clear and present danger of harm to person or property. Incitement to riot, and I've bolded some words here. The law on incitement to riot is you organize, promote, encourage, participate in, or carry on a riot. Now, the word encourage here is the word that's going to get President Trump in trouble and all these other individuals, even if they weren't at the riot themselves, if they are proven to have encouraged the acts. And again, this is all on social media, so it's documented. But this urging or instigating does not include advocacy of ideas or expressions of belief, only as long as those ideas and beliefs are not themselves advocacies of acts of violence. And this, again, boldness, or the assertion of the rightness of or the right to commit violent acts. So this is really clear. If the president gets on stage and says, I think we were defrauded by election, I think the election was fraud, and that's terrible, and we should all come out in 2022 and vote back, he's in the clear. But when he gives a speech that says, hey, go down to this spot and interrupt this thing that's going on, or during the insurrection himself, when he says that they're patriots or gives any indication of the assertion of the rightness or the right to commit, that this is a justified act, that crosses that rather bright line into a much grayer area where you're now dealing really clear with an incitement charge. And I'm not going to say whether he is or isn't in this. I'm going to let the mullet talk to it. Okay, I will say, because I've done the work, I think he incited the insurrection, but I understand there's valid disagreements on that, and it's because you go from a very bright line of, hey, the election was fraud, I think I was cheated. That's advocacy of ideas or expression of beliefs. That's protected. But as soon as you get into encouraging an act, especially if the act happens, or you get into the rightness or the right to commit violent acts, you are crossing into that gray area of an incitement to riot. Domestic terrorism, the next most easy thing you can charge people with, Chapter 18, U.S. Code 2331, right? These are acts that are dangerous to human life, criminal, with an intention to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. And these are the criteria. I've bolded 2 here. The next 2 are key. Influence the policy of government by intimidating or coercing a civilian population. Now, you can argue that the broadcast nature of this event was intended to intimidate or coerce the civilian population. I think that's a weak argument. The much stronger argument is the next one down. Influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. So much of what goes on January 6th, it's important to remember, is this wasn't just storming a Capitol at a time to hold a sit-in. This was during the certification of the Electoral College. So there is an active act of lawful authority going on that has enormous implications, that this movement was designed to impede, obstruct, and change. And so this domestic terrorism, I think this is the strongest piece of the domestic. Again, this isn't going to apply to everyone, but they're going to find evidence that by intimidation or coercion, they wanted to influence, to stop the Electoral College counts, to reverse it, to do any of those things. Once you're in the Capitol and you're doing that, you're probably guilty of domestic terrorism. Whether they charge it or not, that's one thing. The other 2, I don't think there's much evidence. I know there's been a lot of discussion about, not mass destruction because they didn't bring in bombs, but assassination or kidnapping. There was a lot of rumors floating around that clearly they were intending to do that. I don't think the evidence is very strong. I think this is, and we'll get into when we talk about the historical examples of insurrection, a lot of insurrections start as protests that form into riots that then morph into insurrections. They are not exceedingly well planned out to the point where assassination and kidnapping is like. Now, there may be individuals, again, individuals inside that mass group, maybe somebody had that idea and they find evidence of it, they're going to hit them with that one. But overall, I don't think that's going to be much of what's going on. So right there, we've deconflicted domestic terrorism and riots. Let me pause here. Wow, there's so many good comments. Let's see if I can catch up here. Okay, Laura, based on interview, I've seen people reported out by people who have been arrested. Many said they went to and entered the Capitol at the direction of the president. That to me is quite telling. The perpetrators state in court that they took these acts as direction requests. That is useful, but only to a degree, because think about somebody who wants to cut a deal with the police, say in a protest, right? And there was a case here in Louisiana, one of the Black Lives Matters protests. There was and this is a question of incitement to riot, a perfect example of what I see the discussion of criminal justice reform. The organizer of the Black Lives protest was charged because someone in that crowd threw a rock at the police officer. And because the organizer organized the protest, he was charged with incitement of riot. And I don't know if that case has been resolved. It was an ongoing case in Louisiana. The question is, do you want to just take it on the testimony of the person who threw the rock? Because the police may say, hey, turn on this guy and say you were following his direction, we'll cut you a deal. I think that gets into a gray area. Now, clearly, I think as us as civilians and the senators as politicians, the trial coming up is not a court of law. But if this were a court of law, I'd be hesitant to say, first of all, I'd be hesitant to say that someone simply saying they took direction is evidence in itself enough. But I think the actions of the president, the statements of the president, and his actions as we get to insurrection, after and during the insurrection itself, are very telling, because it's not just what he did at the rally, and that's the key part. It's what happened during the event and after the event as well. If they were planning or doing it already, is it really inciting and encouraging? Mike, great question. Yes, it is. If you happen to be unlucky enough to be standing in front of a people who are determined to murder a bunch of folks, and you say, just as a joke, hey, go murder them, and they do, guess what? You won the bad idea lottery for that day, almost as bad as investing in GameStop. Yeah, so if people were already planning, and you get out there and you make a public, and we'll get to this in insurrection, because it's this incitement isn't just that you caused them to do it, but you gave them a motivation, a rightness to act, a rightness of their commission of the act. You gave them moral fortitude. All of these things are wrapped into this definition of incitement. Zip tie guy brought them for a reason, but his intent. So the zip ties, I'm of mixed opinions of that, because zip ties are used all over the world in flash riots now to create spontaneous barriers. And what they often use are the industrial strength, human zip ties, because what they do, like you saw this in Hong Kong, they bring zip ties in knowing that they want to make barriers on the spot, and then they use the zip ties to create the barriers to impede people removing them after they've entered. So I would want to see specific evidence of where did they get the zip ties, obviously anything on his computer, pull up like that. This is where kidnapping, you really got to get into a little bit more than, obviously it's a material thing. I think they need to look at the guy very carefully. But I'd say just having zip ties in a modern protest movement is not indication of kidnapping sufficient alone, because of this this contextual factor of what you can use. Now, it could be evidence of a riot that you're going to, damage property by zip tying them together. But I'd want to see more evidence. And then, so let's go back to Keep, because now we're going to get to the interesting. That's the easy stuff. Riots and domestic terrorism. Clearly a riot happened at Capitol Hill. There was 3 or more people, one of which did something. Domestic terrorism, I'm willing to argue some of the people in there were guilty of domestic terrorism. Let's go to the next ones, because now we go into the bonus rounds. Okay, easy stuff's out of the way. Next one, believe it or not, the next most easy thing to prove is rebellion and insurrection. This is 18 U.S. Code 2383. And in the Mega Mullet, I go through this in detail. Now, rebellions and insurrections are key. A lot of people have a no true Scotsman approach to what a rebellion or insurrection is. And this is why I go to the law and the historical cases. They want to say, well, you have to be armed to have an insurrection, or you have to succeed to have an insurrection, or it has to last a bunch of months to have an insurrection. No. It's 2 or more people who do any of the following: conspire to overthrow the government. I don't think that was things. There was no really legitimate way to overthrow the government. Levy war against the government. These folks aren't levying war. Oppose by force the authority of the government. You can see this if the police were coming into an area and you're resisting that, like they're coming in to arrest someone or something like that. You can see that opposing by force. But the next 2 here are the deets and the receipts that will put people in jail for insurrection. These 2 specifically really apply to what happened on January 6th. It's by force, prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law. Now that seems really broad. Like, hey, if I cause a problem with someone issuing a speeding ticket, am I guilty of insurrection or rebellion? No. Insurrection doesn't have a lot of case law, but insurrection is one of the most well understood concepts in constitutional scholarship and founding father discussion, because they lived it. If you go back and read any of these founding articles, insurrection is probably one of the most common terms for conflict that they use in discussion of what they did, other rebellions that occur, all the way through about the 18th, 19th century. So there's a really good foundation of what an insurrection is and isn't. But by force, prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law, and I'm going to give you a historical example of this. The last one is the key one. By force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States contrary to the authority thereof. That last phrase is Greek, contrary to the authority thereof. So this is where the insurrection, for me, the litmus test for an insurrection is not just that you went into federal property, which happens, but you did it specifically to hinder, prevent, or delay the execution or authority. And this is where Trump is in a world of hurt, and those people who went in the Capitol, because it wasn't just, look, the Michigan COVID protest that happened last year, right? People go into the Capitol, everyone was really worried because they had firearms, but the law is you can carry a firearm. I don't consider that insurrection. They weren't preventing, hindering, or delaying the execution laws, and they weren't by force or seizure taking possession of a property. January 6th in the Capitol, that is the Electoral College certification. That is a execution of a law, perhaps one of the most critical execution of the law, and they went in there to delay or hinder it or and seize the property upon which it was occurring. That is what makes this circumstance very, very different from all the other ones that we can talk about. Now, there's some gray area cases like the Mahler wildlife refugee. I wouldn't call that an insurrection because even though it's federal property that they occupied, they're not really delaying the execution of law. You may get them on seizure of property, but I would be careful. I would prefer that to call domestic terrorism or something else. I wouldn't call it insurrection. I want to save insurrection for specific acts, but these acts don't have to be long-term in nature. They don't have to involve tens of thousands of people. They don't have to involve armaments. And the reason why I say insurrection and rebellion are very well studied is we've had a lot of them in the country. Let's put aside the big one, the American Revolution, and the second big one, the Civil War, which, by the way, President Lincoln called the Civil War a great insurrection for a reason. Those were not accidental words on his part. There's like I said, insurrection means a lot when you get into the history of the United States. But some historical examples that are similar to the January 6th. So I went looking through all these different ones. First of all, Shays Rebellion happens before technically the United States of America with the Constitution. We're operating under the Articles of Confederation. George Washington has to put down what this is there's a debt, Revolutionary War debt has caused this financial crisis where there's mass inflation, the Continental Congress, the money is worthless, and the debts that farmers are owed can't be paid. So courts are set up, debtors court, where the farmers are brought in, they're forced to liquidate, and the creditors get all their stuff. The Shays Rebellion specifically involved groups of people entering a court and disrupting the court proceedings when a case was happening such that the debt could not be liquidated. That fits the definition of force of prevent, of hinder or delay the execution of law and to seize a property. These were small courthouses. Granted, it was a couple of thousand people, but each individual one may have been 50 people, 100 people. That's an insurrection. They did it for debt relief, but it's still an insurrection. And you go back and you look at the founding fathers, they all knew this. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, all of these folks are referring to these things as insurrections in their own words. So it's kind of like, if you want to go with the founding fathers is knowing what they were talking about, here's an example. Then in the Great Revival period, which happens, the Civil War happens, Reconstruction happens, and the Revival or the Great Awakening happens, which is the return of white supremacy to the South. There's this huge backlash and a series of insurrections over 2 decades. I classify that entire period as an insurgency, but there were a couple in key here. The election riot of 1874, very specifically applicable to Capitol. An election happened, they didn't like the results, so these groups like the Red Shirt League, the White League, the KKK, they rallied up a mob. The mob stormed the state legislature or the city hall where the elected officials were about to be seated and sworn in and disrupted it, right? Very similar to the Capitol Hill. You have a riot that forms in and they go to take possession to prevent a political act that they don't want to see happen. Battle of Liberty Place in 1874, Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, very similar. Here's one that is directly relevant, and it's important because it's 20th century, right? The Capitol Hill shooting of 1954. You have several Puerto Rican nationalist separatists, right? There's a separatist movement in Puerto Rico. They've already conducted several acts of terrorism. It's a well-known thing. They come into the U.S. Capitol, right? Same building, same location. They open fire, 5 people die. I mean, I don't know how much closer you can get to what happened on January 6th in the Puerto Rican. They wanted the government to do something that wasn't being done. They go in, shots are fired, some by the people, some by the police. people die, 5 people die. In charging these individuals, they are actually charged with seditious conspiracy and insurrection. And it is the case law of this that I think is going to be cited, because what they've found is that a big part of insurrection, or we'll get into the seditious conspiracy here next, but this is the case that is going to be the case law that I think becomes relevant to this. And its companion piece is seditious conspiracy, which I probably just realized that I don't have a thing. So I'm going to do it off the top of my head. The link's in there. Seditious conspiracy is when you, let me actually make sure to check here. Pause while I check to see if I've got this. Nope. Interesting. Okay, I thought I had seditious conspiracy. I'll have to spitball it here. Give me a quick second. We'll edit this out to make it look intelligent later. So seditious conspiracy is actually when 2 or more people conspire to incite effectively what is a rebellion and insurrection, or give aid and comfort to an insurrection that has or is happening. And this is where I think Trump has run afoul, and a lot of people will run afoul, because it's not just did you incite them to do something, what did you do during and as it was over? Because if you give aid and comfort to an insurrection, you are guilty of seditious conspiracy. And it's this case from the Capitol Hill shooting of 1954, went all the way up to the a district appeal, didn't go to the Supreme Court, but went up to a U.S. appeals court, and came down with a ruling that even if you weren't at the location where the violence happened, if you gave encouragement or aid or comfort to the people that were involved, you were guilty by that act by seditious conspiracy. And this puts Trump's behavior in the White House during the insurrection, which we don't know for sure. There's lots of allegations. We don't know for sure what it was, what he did, what he didn't do. That's where they're going to call witnesses and try and figure out what he was doing at the time. There's lots of reports, but we know for sure he came out with that tweet at about 6 p.m., the 6:04 p.m. It was after Biden, President-elect Biden had done his video tweet. Trump came out, and in that tweet, he refers to the people storming the Capitol as great patriots, great Americans. That is encouragement, aid, and comfort for an ongoing insurrection. That is seditious conspiracy. So this is important to remember. Again, impeachment trials have nothing to do with the law, everything to do with politics. So we got to remember, we can't overthink this. But if this was a law case, when the president does that at 6 o'clock, this is, well into it, he's giving aid and comfort to the people who are committing insurrection. Twitter did him a favor by pulling that out. Of course, it's been captured. It's not like anything disappears off the internet. But that right there, I think, would be enough for seditious conspiracy. And the last one we're going to get to in the law, then I'll go to some more questions, because we're going to get to another category that people like to talk about, is treason. Again, Chapter 18, great chapter for violence and instability, 2381. Treason is when you levy war against the United States, you adhere to the enemies of the United States, or you're giving the enemies of the United States aid or comfort. I don't think anyone that was involved in, based on the evidence so far in January 6th, is guilty of treason. And a lot of people are like, traitors, treason. No, you've got to be dealing. Treason is the hardest thing to prove, because it deals with levying war, not just an insurrection or riot, but levying war, or being supported by an enemy of the United States. Now, there's some allegations that there were suspicious Bitcoin transfers by Russians into some of these groups. Well, that's a question of, is Russia an enemy of the United States? Are we in a state of war? No. And so it gets really tricky with treason to prove this, to the point that you need to in a court. So I don't think we're going to see any treason charges come out of this. I think we're going to see a lot of the riots. I think we're going to see some of the insurrections and some of the seditious conspiracy, but I don't think we're going to see any treason. Yeah, the guy who claimed he found the zip ties and forgot to give them the cops is not helping himself. It's one of those things as a lawyer. Don't ever talk unless you need to. People watching Hamilton. Turn. Yep, Turn is a good one. Lucas is asking, how do you think a Senate acquittal of President Trump for seditious conspiracy will affect a hypothetical court case for the same act? Not going to get into that because that's an impeachment. Great question. Yep, Christie's doing the links here for seditious insurrection. Could Trump be charged by the law for insurrection? Again, going into impeachment. Generally, quick answer to these questions on impeachment. Impeachment is a political act. It does not prohibit you from being charged by crime of the same act after the impeachment trial is over. Mike, verbal support is considered aid and comfort if it falls within that criteria of hitting the Brandenburg test of incitement and or giving giving the rightness to commit a criminal act. If President Trump had said, it's tragic that there's a bunch of people getting hurt right now on the Capitol, I think that's bad, he's probably in safe ground. When he refers to the people as great patriots, great Americans, stuff like that, you could argue he didn't know. You know, he's uninformed. He knows the people at his rally. He doesn't know what's going on. That could be a defense made. But when you give, it's one thing to kind of do it as a general sense. It's another to speak to the specific people and give them a righteous, a rightness of the commission of the act. Because remember, the building was not cleared yet at the time. So think of it this way: if someone storms a state legislature, let's say a random state legislature, and while they're inside, a state representative says, "Attaboy, Adams, don't leave, hold your ground. You're doing a good job. You're doing the Lord's work." That is considered that verbal. Now, 3 weeks later, if I say, "Yeah, I thought they were right," that's not really giving aid and comfort. It's not in the mid. It's not, with these speech laws, the proximity to the events is very, very key in how these judge these. The Brandenburg test, and this is why it's so bad for Trump. Had that rally occurred the weekend before, I think he'd be fine. It occurred the morning of, the people went directly from there to the next, the things happened, and during that event, he had those statements. So it's the proximity of the events themselves that is a key lens here, not just that any verbal support is made at any time. Yeah, so let's go now to the really hard ones that are mainly for deconflicting conflict, because it's unlikely people can do them. This is going to be a really long Ask Me Anything, but people are interested. So insurgency, right? Non-state actor challenging state actor. This is my specialty, insurgencies. They make it, an insurgent makes it impossible to perform a state function. So the functions, they usurp the functions. Some of these functions they take onto themselves. Local level political legitimacy, rule of law, monopoly on the use of force, taxation, control of movement, regulation of the economy. Insurgents begin, not all of them, but they take some of them and they often co-occupy a spot with the state authority where they may control it at the night, the state authority controls it during the day. Generally, an insurgency must pass that 17% notional threshold. We aren't there yet. This isn't an insurgency. So this isn't, what happened on January 6th is not an insurgency. Clear that deck. Revolutions and civil wars. This gets tricky only because these terms are so convoluted that it's really hard to tease them apart. But Mike Duncan, great podcaster, he does revolutions. He describes a revolution as a cross-class alliance of dissidents overthrowing the regime by extra-legal means that then alters the political system in some fundamental ways. You can find a bazillion definitions. They're all variations of one or more factions have a mutually exclusive claim to power to which they fight over that power, and they have some percentage of the population that supports them in that power. Now, I add to this, when I distinguish a revolution and a civil war, to me, a revolution is when a new faction is arising and that new faction starts with 0% of the state and military power. They have to create new institutions. They create a new government. They create a new military. They're often recruiting from scratch. They may get defectors, but they're building anew. And often revolutions have a social system change within them. Civil wars, the difference is they're often pre-existing factions. Each faction takes some of the military and state power. When they split, they may have local troops come to their side. They may have the legislatures that they were operating in. These carry over institutions and military into the factions. They absorb it. They don't have to create it anew. They're simply taking it. Also, the social change in civil war is not as common. They often occur because of ethnic separatism or ideological bases. Now, you may say, Tim, that sounds a lot like the American Revolution, right? That was a colonial system of government which you know, existed beforehand and simply took some of this stuff, you know, away from the king. Isn't that, you just said that's a civil war? Well, this is the problem, is historians don't follow these guidelines. They're not scientific. Your mileage may vary, and this is a very disputed area. Revolutions can become civil wars, like the Arab Spring in Syria became the Syrian Civil War. Revolutions themselves may actually be better typified as civil wars because they evolve pre-existing factions. It's very complicated, but the key thing is January 6th was not a revolution or civil war. There is no, none of these things apply. And the last one, is a coup. And this one has been bugging me because everyone jumps on coup, and it's like the word collusion. The word collusion does not exist in the criminal code. Like, there's a perfect word that you could use instead of collusion. It's called conspiracy, and it has a definition. Likewise, coup is not defined anywhere in the US code, and everyone wants to use it for January 6th. Well, I don't think it applies, because the coup, so a revolution or civil war has a faction that has some sort of popular support. Even if it's not a lot, it can be some. A coup, by definition, almost is a small group or faction that seizes power. They have little to no popular support, and they often consist of prior instituted military, peacekeeping, or other lawful institutions. So there's this pre-existing nature of a coup. They've already in place. They already have the levers of power, but they use those levers in illegal ways. So disobeying civilian control, mutiny against superior officers in the military. You're seeing this in Myanmar right now, right? The Myanmar coup, the coups that happened literally over the last 3 days, is a perfect example of this. The military is the military that was in place that Aung San was over as the civilian government. They obviously had a lot of power. They'd been a dictatorship for decades while she was in prison. She gets released from prison, kind of cuts a deal with them, goes to, make a deal with the devil in some ways, and now it's bitter. But they were already existing in these institutional powers, and all they did is simply take the power back. And the power in a coup is gained by the seizure of state institutions. So you're seizing not a building, you're seizing the literal institution of power itself. The courts, communications, you often find radio, TV stations seized, political assemblies. They're seized and held by these pre-existing factions that are under the control of a very small group. And the small group faction then becomes the governing power. So everyone wants to call January 6th a coup. I don't agree. Now, this is Tim's definition, so you can yell at me and throw things at me. January 6th is not a coup. It's like Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's not a coup, So what is January 6th? January 6th consists of a riot, domestic terrorism, and insurrection all overlaying in one event. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the event is guilty of all three, but these things all happen co-simultaneously. And you're going to have some people, I think, the charges are going to reflect a mix of these things. The vast majority are going to be riot-related charges, trespassing, unlawful entry, illegal obstruction. A few are going to be domestic terrorism, probably the ones that are violence related, or if they find someone was actively planning to kidnap or assassinate, that'll come down as domestic terrorism. A lot are going to be insurrection, not as much as the riot, but a lot more than domestic terrorism are going to be insurrection, because the intent was to impede or hinder the lawful execution of the Electoral College. So this is a situation now. Over on the right are the ones it's not. It's not treason. It's not revolution or civil war. It's not a coup. Right? It's these three things all coexisting on the same spot in time. And that's not unusual. All of the insurrections I listed in the historical examples, many of them started as riots and then became insurrections. The Shays Rebellion, they start as rebellions and they become, these things flow in and out of each other all the time. Let's see here. People are discussing about what's going on in the House with Greens, so this is good. McCarthy, let's see, I'm trying to skip what's going on in the House right now. Lucas, when I asked about the coup, is because there was evidently some law enforcement or military or other institutional support behind the Capitol insurrection, or at least there were allegations of such. Lucas, good question. The presence of military individuals in an act does not necessarily make it a coup. Coup is usually, remember, these people were acting in their private capacities. A coup is typically, like I said, it's a prior instituted force of some sort, using the power they're granted in an illegal way. So the difference between, say, a bunch of people who are military showing up in the insurrection and a unit, let's say there's a unit of military folks that as a unit, their captain says, we're going to go do this. They're following the orders of the captain. They arm themselves, and as a unit, they go and do an action. That is using a prior existing authority in an illegal way. That then becomes the basis of a coup. Not just that there's the presence of individuals, but how they're using prior authorities in illegal ways. Mike's asking here, institutional or multiple individuals. It's multiple. Yeah, they come from. He's referring to the Army. I think I mentioned there was something like 15 people who are veterans. Only 2 were Armor Reserve and 4 police. So even then, if you look percentages wise, out of 400 folks, they've had 6 so far that were active reserve and active law enforcement. Jennifer Dotson, I do not watch Reddit, so I haven't seen that video, but then again, I didn't invest in GameStop either. But I'll take a look at that. Yeah, is that the video? I'm almost saying, I just look at the URL. Is that the video where they're doing the exercise? The Coup goes rolling behind it. I have seen that video. That has been shared. That was the one, for people who don't know, there was somebody doing a TikTok exercise style video on a major highway doing a jazzercise, and behind them come these. I shouldn't laugh. It's very serious. This is very upsetting for people in Myanmar. It's very unfortunate, but it is somewhat in absurdity. Humor lies. Behind her, as she's doing this jazzercise video, come these military vehicles that are just blocking off the highway, and she just keeps doing the exercise. Yeah, so Lucas is talking about, you know, prior conspiracy. There's all these things about removing of panic buttons, apparent live tweeting of capital evacuations. Those are things that you're going to have to get into and individually investigate. I think they've got to be looked at very carefully. Because the removal of the panic, one of the things that happens in a riot like this, you have 1,000 people, like, how do they know where XYZ location was? I call it the ant effect, right? You put 1,000 people into the Capitol, they're going to spread out and find everywhere. The fact that they get into every little nook and cranny of the Capitol could be a factor of 1,000 people spreading out and finding it. It also could be someone intentionally going to a place. Those are the things when it comes to kidnapping, assassination, you have to prove criminal intent. Whereas a riot is just, you're doing it, right? You're there, it's happening. Insurrection, you're there, it's happening. Kidnapping and assassination, they're really going to look for prior evidence. And again, that shouldn't be hard. If someone's planning, you look at the Michigan terror group, right? These people had all sorts of plans of what they were going to do in a house. So all you need to do is you get someone who's a witness, some sort of evidence. You need some evidence that there was an intentional conspiracy to do this. And then they're going to throw the book at them. I think that'll come out in the investigation if it does. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.